I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Today, we're going to start with Will covering the DOJ's indictment of Hamas. Ben is going to then lead us in a discussion of the murders of an American hostage and other hostages that have been held by Hamas. I will cover the first interview of the Kamala Harris and Tim Walz campaign on CNN. And Inez will close us out with all of the media furor over Trump visiting with Gold Star families at Arlington National Cemetery. So with that, we'll go ahead and kick it to Will.
Okay, so news, the Department of Justice announced yesterday that it was unsealing an indictment of 6 major Hamas figures. This indictment was originally filed on February 1st, so quite a long time ago, 7 months ago, but wasn't unsealed until yesterday. And in the interim, 3 of the different people that have been indicted have been killed by Israel. So the indictment, it goes after Ismail Haniyeh, the political head, Yahya Sinwar, who is the current head of Hamas in Gaza since Haniyeh was killed. But he's also the guy who's always been running the show in Gaza and effectively in charge of all the hostages. Mohammed Daif, who's also killed, another Sinwar's right hand, and then a few other people. And I found this indictment interesting because, I've been trying to figure out what people are doing, because it was an obvious idea if you're familiar with the law and the history of terrorism indictments. Because on October 7th, Hamas killed 1,200 people, but it also killed a lot of American citizens, and it took hostage any number more. And there's a very, very clear criminal law that allows the American government to indict people who kill Americans abroad, and engage in terrorism abroad and finance terrorist networks. So all these people were vulnerable to indictment. Now, when you're dealing with a terrorist who's hiding out in a cave somewhere, it's not really a law enforcement matter so much as it is a military matter, obviously. And there's an extent to which you think, okay, like somebody indicting somebody in the District of Columbia or New York is not going to matter if they're holed up in a cave in Afghanistan. But Hamas always had this two-part organization. One part of Hamas was in Gaza, and the other part was this political wing hanging out in Qatar in 5-star hotels. And it was just obvious to me from the beginning that why don't we just indict these people and demand that the Qatari government extradite them to us? What we could do at that point, we could threaten them with, they could spend a whole bunch of time in Florence, Colorado, which has broken a whole bunch of Mexican drug lords, or we could threaten to just hand them right over back to the Israelis and see, whether that woke them up and got their attention about getting our hostages out. And yet, for some reason, the Department of Justice had this indictment in February. All the while, we have American citizens rotting in Gaza. No action, apparently, as far as we know, has been taken on this indictment. No extradition request has been filed with Qatar or any of the other states that are hosting these people and are nominally American allies. Turkey is another good example. And yet, and then finally yesterday, there's a decision, okay, we're just going to unseal it. Well, why? I think it probably connects to Ben's point next, which is that I feel like the Democrats are feeling a little bit of domestic political pressure from the fact that they just sat on their hands and did nothing while an American citizen was held hostage and finally assassinated a few days ago. But that's kind of embarrassing. Like, what is the point of this? Are you going to extradite people? Like, there should be more from the administration about what it actually is going to do about the fact that we just had one of our citizens killed. And this indictment is just, it is obviously, if you were to come up with a coherent American strategy to get the Americans out of Gaza, to do something to Hamas, this indictment would be part of it. But it's not clear to me what exactly the administration is trying to do this, or if they ever wanted this indictment, or if they're actually going to want to use it for anything more than to try and assuage some of their pro-Israel donors. So I'm curious about what you all think about what this indictment means and why it was unsealed yesterday and whether or not anything's been done about it.
I actually have an add-on question to that as well, which is, how does this affect the United States' relationship with the ICC, given that the ICC has gone so hard against Israel?
I wish I had answers for everyone to all of these questions, but I think we're at the point now of speculation in terms of trying to connect the dots of events from, as I'll speak to in my segment, the murder of 6 hostages in Rafah, which, by the way, of course, the Biden-Harris administration never wanted Israel to go into Rafah. So those lives could have been saved probably weeks before, potentially, had Israel not been stalled by the administration. Set that aside for a moment. Even if these indictments were actually handed down in February, we're still talking months after October 7th. How is it possible that the DOJ wouldn't have had indictments ready to go the day after October 7th for leaders of a jihadist organization that engaged in an attack that killed the equivalent of 40,000 Americans, on top of the rapes, hostage taking, murder, mutilation, and beyond? It's obvious, of course, that they were probably walking on eggshells at that point, even several months after October 7th. Unsealing this now, and not just 2 months before an election, but really just weeks and days really before early voting starts at its earliest point, to me is the ultimate messaging sort of move. It has nothing to do with the merits or the substance. To Will's point about what would a coherent strategy look like for exerting pressure to free Americans, it's clear that the administration had no coherent strategy, because ultimately they were willing to let hostages die, Hamas survive for months on end. I would argue, and as I have argued on here for months, in service of its Iran first policy with respect to the Middle East. You can't go offending any of Iran's proxies. Doesn't matter if they commit the ultimate acts of savagery and barbarism. We're going to let Americans die in captivity in sacrifice for that policy. To me, that explains almost everything you need to know about the Biden-Harris policy in the Middle East, one that I think Kamala Harris would put on steroids based upon the position she's taken, based upon her closest staffers on these issues. So, I think to Will's point, this is a purely political move by the administration. The timing of it following this effort to try and push Israel to get to a quote-unquote ceasefire after the hostages were murdered and recovered and brought back to Israel last Saturday, Israeli time. Maybe this is an effort to put a carrot to the Netanyahu administration. But I think it's probably, as with everything on the foreign policy side for this administration, there's a massive domestic element to it. And the domestic element is, see, we're opposing Hamas, even though we just let an American get murdered there and have done nothing to try and accelerate the collapse, the destruction of Hamas, to punish them for the blood of Americans that are on their hands.
Yeah, I agree with the idea that this is domestic, and I think it says quite a lot. So Kamala's positioning in the last several weeks on this, before we discovered that these 6 hostages were murdered, and then after the statements, both from the Biden administration officially and from Kamala Harris, I think they indicate a kind of shift that's been happening since the convention. By the way, I think I mentioned a few weeks ago that I had a bit of a debate or bet with my husband Jarrett on whether or not there would be a massive blowup at the convention. And I think I kind of won that bet in the sense that there was some unrest, but there wasn't. And it shows how much control the top level Democratic operatives have over that sort of street wing of their party. The biggest issue for which was this Israeli-Palestinian issue. But at the convention, they either tried not to mention Israel at all, but then they did applaud Hersh's parents at the convention, right? And it's notable that Hamas has so little fear of America that even a hostage with that level of kind of exposure in the American media and the American political system was dispatched in this horrible, brutal way without, worry for consequences for Hamas, right? But I think it says that between now and the election, they're going to be nominally more pro-Israel. I think they think they have in jettisoning Joe Biden from the ticket. I think they've consolidated the leftist part of their base. They've accepted that that kind of deal. I think the leftist base has accepted that deal, knowing that after the election, they're going to have a seat at the table on this and every other issue. So I see this very much as a kind of a superficial political way of speaking, because the majority of Americans do support Israel. They're going to try to downplay the radicals of their own side for the next, whatever it is, 7-8 weeks. But the radicals have essentially the agreement of the potential Harris administration that they're going to have a seat at the table. And think about all those staffers in the Biden administration who have come out mostly anonymously because they're too cowardly to actually lose their jobs over this, but and criticized any pro-Israel policy, any moderately pro-Israel policy from the Biden administration. So I think this has actually quite a lot about where those internal dynamics are in the Democratic Party.
We're going to go ahead and move to Ben, who's actually going to dive a little bit deeper into the situation involving the hostages in Israel, where Hamas has now murdered one of the American hostages.
Thanks for that, Amber. So as I alluded to, this over the last weekend, we found out that Israel had recovered the remains of 6 hostages, including Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, an American citizen, in the tunnels under Rafah, which I know, as I noted, the Biden administration was loath for Israel to ever invade. Hamas has said that these executions took place because Israeli forces were closing in on them, and there's a new directive now for Hamas to kill hostages whenever Israel is close to saving those hostages. Tells you everything you need to know about Hamas. And what was the response to this? Was it outrage broadly in corporate media here and abroad? Was it outrage at Hamas's savagery? Was it anger at the Biden administration for not exerting all of its pressure on Hamas and all of its proxies and partners, like Qatar, for example, like Iran, for example? Was it now a newfound desire among the Biden-Harris administration for Israel to finish the job, annihilate Hamas, maintain total security control over Gaza for the foreseeable future, never permit Hamas or anyone associated with Hamas from ever reigning over whatever regime might take hold in Gaza down the road? Of course not. Instead, it was, these deaths are on Benjamin Netanyahu's hands, and the TDS cohort, but representing the anti-Bibi cohort in Israel, actually went out and protested in the streets. Reportedly, tens, if not hundreds of thousands, protested in the streets, demanding a ceasefire, precisely what Hamas, of course, would want, because a ceasefire would allow Hamas to survive and effectively win the war. The Biden administration, what was its response? It was to say, and this is a one-word answer, I believe, from Joe Biden, no, when asked if Benjamin Netanyahu was doing enough to get to a ceasefire. Let's step back for a second, because the hostages have been cynically exploited not only by Hamas, but effectively by their supporters in the West to try and use the hostages as a justification to force Israel to effectively lose the war, to not destroy Hamas, to topple Benjamin Netanyahu or threaten his leadership in the middle of the war, destabilize the government, and cynically use the hostages as in a trade for many multiples of those hostages in jihadists. By the way, Sinwar, of course, arguably the leader of this genocidal jihadist effort from Hamas, himself had been a prisoner in Israel and released in a prior hostage swap, leading to ultimately October 7th. But the end goal is force an end to the infighting, leveraging the lives of the hostages to say, we must bring this to an end, trade the hostages for multiples of terrorists who will go out and inflict mass bloodshed down the road, have a ceasefire that turns into a permanent end to the war, allow Hamas not only to survive, but then potentially Hamas-aligned forces to surge back into Gaza to the extent Israel is forced off of the border between Gaza and Egypt and forced to relinquish control, essentially, of the territory that Israel chose to voluntarily left, and which turned into a terror state. And then, of course, pave the path for a two-state solution, rewarding the Palestinian Arabs who overwhelmingly support Hamas and their efforts and their leaders to reward them, essentially, for all the bloodshed. So the perverse aspect of this to me is that you have Biden-Harris, and they put all the pressure on Israel rather than the savage jihadist group that killed an American, that has the blood of Americans from prior to this execution on their hands. Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly caved into demands in connection with these purported terms of deals, at least a couple of times with Hamas. Hamas is not even at the table. It's basically the Qataris, the Egyptians, working on Hamas's behalf effectively in these negotiations, but all the pressure goes one way, on the victim. The aggressor is treated as the victim here. The actual victim is treated as somehow the retrograde force. So, I'm outraged as an American that Americans are dying as a consequence of this administration's policies, not of the policies of Israeli leadership that are having to deal with massive international pressure, domestic pressure, Biden administration orchestrated pressure, which has gone on since the attempts to destabilize the Benjamin Netanyahu government since its latest inception. But I think, the broader point that ought to be made here, and there are obviously any different number of directions we can take this, but this sums up progressive foreign policy. Progressive foreign policy is our allies are to be treated as our adversaries. Our enemies are to be treated as the victims. No ally can be allowed to actually go about prosecuting and winning a war. We don't believe in winning wars anymore. There's only stalemates. Israel can never be allowed to win. The jihadists always have to be allowed to get to a stalemate. And it's the Iran first policy. This is the natural consequence of it. And again, I'd point out, Kamala Harris is more extreme and radical than Joe Biden on these issues. So the broader point, I guess, is we are in grave danger under a Harris administration going forward. And this is just a microcosm of it. The Biden-Harris administration's treatment of Israel vis-a-vis not only the Gazans, but Iran writ large. And Americans who have been left sitting ducks in the region beyond Israel is a natural consequence of their policy, which is we're willing to sacrifice Americans' lives in service of empowering the world's leading state sponsor of the world's leading state sponsor of jihad. And part of that is we need to hem in Israel on all sides because Israel is the only thing standing between Iran and its hegemony over the Middle East.
Yeah, I pick up on a few of the threads, Ben, that you put out there. The first is just to reference my comments from the last segment. The convenience of blaming Netanyahu in this situation, right? It allows the Democratic Party to get out of the bind, the internal bind that it's in between the general polls showing strong support for Israel and the obvious hatred of Israel verging oftentimes into violence and anti-Semitism of the progressive left-wing base, right? And so if you think about it that way, like blaming Bibi seems it seems like a solution, a political solution to the problem, right? It allows them to get out without, they can say some of the actual policies that their left flank want them to say, but they can say it's because of how this particular Israeli government, right, is behaving when that's really not. I mean, there are all kinds of problems. I'm not even going to start or pretend to understand in Israeli politics. Bibi is not very popular in Israel. But in this case, domestically in America, blaming Netanyahu is a way to get themselves out of that bind between the opinions of general American public on this conflict and the opinions of their base, right? Their activist base. But the larger problem here, and we've been obviously talking about this at this point for almost a year, since October 7th, is something that isn't solvable within the parameters that keep being set by the world, where Israel does very well and wins all of these actual military conflicts. But then essentially the rest of the world resets Palestinians at zero as though they hadn't just lost a war, right? And I mean, I think we've I don't want to get too philosophical here and go too far off track, but I don't think that that's necessarily good. Certainly not going to produce any kind of peace. This insistence on the two-state solution and resetting after every ceasefire violation by Palestinians, by Hamas, or by other Palestinian organizations, it doesn't actually solve the problem. And that's why we're stuck with this intractable problem generation after generation. It's because essentially the Palestinians are not allowed by the rest of the world to lose a war and to actually grapple with the fact that they've lost this war. And allows them to continue killing Israelis, in this case, also killing Americans, and taking both Israelis and Americans hostage. So don't see a solution in sight, certainly with Harris administration. There is some hope that at least the Middle East can move beyond that intractable conflict with the Abraham Accords, which of course was under the Trump administration and presumably would be part of what a new Trump administration would bring back, moving beyond this conflict and this framing of a conflict that is necessary to somehow solve this intractable problem before we simply start to look to our direct interests in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, it really is something that, you know, they kill one of our hostages and the demand of the administration is to negotiate more. It's just unthinkable. It really just morally depraved administration. And it's not just us. I mean, it's the United Kingdom too. Everybody's putting out this message of Hamas will pay, and that's why we need a ceasefire right now. What are you talking about? You know, if this is the kind of thing where you stop negotiating and impose some meaningful punishment on Hamas, maybe, I don't know, say every single weapon, you know, figure out a way to give them more weapons, figure out a way to tell Israel, like, you can do what you will, like, we don't care. Figure out a way to, maybe the United States should have responded to this by announcing that we have recognized the Philadelphia corridor as Israeli territory permanently, that they've effectively annexed it, and we, you know, permanently recognize that they have sovereignty over it. Something like that, something that is just like irreversible, and Hamas will just, so that everybody knows, you ever kill an American citizen again, you will suffer whatever consequences that can be suffered as a result.
I was reminded when the news broke of the hostages being killed of what Donald Trump said about the negotiations months ago, but then again a couple of weeks ago, which is that he did not believe that Hamas had all of the hostages that he claimed to have, that some of them had been killed, and that's why they keep blowing up the ceasefire negotiations, because they can't produce the people that they've promised Israel that they will produce. I'm going to go ahead and take the moderator's prerogative here to move into my topic, which is this Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, although it was sort of a Harris-Walz interview that took place on CNN almost 40 days, if not exactly 40 days, after Kamala Harris became the presumptive Democratic nominee after Biden dropped off of the ticket. So we finally get the interview. Of course, it's on CNN. Dana Bash, who has previously interviewed Kamala Harris in a puff piece at Howard University while they're socially distanced and wearing masks during the pandemic, while sitting next to her. Aesthetically, the interview was horrendous. They had Kamala in the background and her running mate and the reporter in the foreground. They had her in a gray suit against a black and gray backdrop. This was supposedly at a diner, but it looked like a really deranged corporate boardroom. And they go through the interview, and Dana Bash asks questions about Kamala's history of policy flip-flopping, but she doesn't really drill down on any of the particulars. She doesn't really challenge her that hard on it. And Kamala Harris immediately hands a gift to the Trump campaign by saying that her values haven't changed. Her policies have changed, but her values haven't, which immediately gives the Trump campaign the easy attack that she is still who she said she was in 2019 when she was running in the Democratic primary in 2020. And then Tim Walz is asked about his misrepresentations of his service record and his lies about his family's fertility treatments, mistaking IUI for IVF. And again, he gets off the hook so easily by just a singular question from Dana Bash that's almost apologetic that she's even asking it, and claims that it was all bad grammar and that he just talks like a regular person. And the cumulative effect of this interview is everyone else in the mainstream media who might have the opportunity to interview Kamala and Tim in the future, although there's really no reason for them to do it now because they can claim that they check that box, is going to look and say, well, Dana Bash asked about that. There's no reason for me to repeat that question. So she's essentially taken these scandals off of the table in terms of what another mainstream media reporter might ask about. And then Kamala, from a more policy strategy standpoint, is creating intentionally plausible deniability for her policy changes. She has not addressed specifically why she's changed her mind, supposedly, on electric vehicle mandates, the Green New Deal, decriminalizing illegal immigration, and all of these other issues. Still doesn't have a policy platform on her website, and has announced most of these changes, by the way, through anonymous campaign officials, so that when she naturally gets into office and governs like she would have if had she won the Democratic primary in 2019, she can say, well, I never really said that myself, or it wasn't on my website. Plausible deniability. So I'm curious on your all's thoughts on the interview, but it was pretty much what I expected, which was we're going to pretend to ask some challenging questions, but we're not really going to press them or hold them accountable. And then naturally, Dana Bash ended the interview by talking about the iconic moments that happened at the Democratic National Convention with Kamala Harris's grandniece and Tim Walz's son, and basically giving a journalistic apology for everything that she had asked them prior that might have been semi-difficult. Kamala had 40 days to prepare for this. This is what we got. Basically the bare minimum of being semi-intelligible. I don't think it boded well for the Harris-Walz campaign at all.
So I agree completely with your assessment of the interview. I think by traditional standards, right, this was an awful interview from everything from the aesthetics that you did mention. I mean, she looked like, you know, sort of low-level staffer behind the table.
And Dana Bash is like 5 feet tall, by the way, and she looked smaller than Dana Bash.
Yeah, if you want to see like what an actual adversarial presidential interview bordering on the unfair, of course, looks like with Dana Bash, you can look back and see how she interviewed JD Vance a couple weeks ago. But I think by traditional standards, all of what you've described is exactly what happened. If you're a campaign that is just trying to make it the next 7 weeks with the vibes bubble that seems to be deflating a little bit, just like propping it up just enough to get over the finish line, and while answering absolutely nothing on the record about any specifics and trying to stay essentially as much as possible out of, you know, just to avoid any of the traditional questions that might be asked of a campaign. I think this is kind of a W, right? As you say, at the end, you said yourself, she checked this box. The questions that were asked were some of the things that the Trump campaign has been bringing up on the campaign trail. And more than ever, my conclusion with this interview, which by the way was sort of embarrassingly chopped up into tiny little segments so that it felt like it was a longer interview, and in reality it was like 18 or 19 minutes of actual talking and being interviewed, but it was chopped up. It's like 2 minutes and 30 seconds and then a big break, right? So that it felt more like longer and more substantive than it was. I think that if you're Kamala, you're happy with this, right? There wasn't a clip that came out of it that really went viral of her being completely ridiculous or inarticulate. I don't know. I kind of think you're happy with this. It does put pressure. I think bottom line, it puts a ton of pressure on the debate on the 10th, and then on the Trump-Vance campaign, because clearly the media is not going to do their job. It's completely up to the campaign and to this debate as probably the one time that Kamala will be on the stage being forced to actually respond to things in live time before the American people in anything like an adversarial environment. It puts a lot of pressure on both Trump and Vance in those debates, and then in the next 7 weeks on their campaign to keep bringing these things up over and over again until the Harris campaign is forced in some way to respond to them.
It's worth noting it's really less than 7 weeks because the voting is already going to start in certain places. And I agree that the stakes are raised to just unfathomable heights of a debate. And I feel like that is probably an intentional play by the Harris side of things. They want to limit the potential opportunities to incur massive, severe damage vis-a-vis Harris's positions to the extent she has them being at all exposed. You know, she's going to have certain pre-practiced lines ready to go, certain facts at her disposal that she's going to turn to. I imagine some planned barbs to try and get under Donald Trump's skin. And the question is going to be, how do you disarm her and force her off balance so that she has to go effectively off teleprompter, knowing that, you know, to your point about the media and its job, corporate media perceives its job as whatever it takes to help Harris-Walz win, period, full stop. And it's really, it doesn't even really matter Harris-Walz. Help the regime win. So when people lament about the media today, I think we have to stop thinking about it as, well, they're there to help us discern truth and look behind sort of the smoke screens that are put up towards why do the events that happen? You know, how do we get to the truth of the heart of a matter and then let the public decide for themselves? No, these are propagandists on behalf of the regime. So it's obviously the most hostile information space one can imagine, even before we talk about, you know, the big tech censorship and potentially, again, the national security apparatus colluding with big tech. So I think it's incumbent upon the Trump campaign in response. And as we've seen from this, you know, 18 minutes or whatever it was of actual footage and discussion, this is clearly a protected basement 2.0 campaign, and you have to be able to hammer 1 to 3 clear and coherent points over and over again to make the case for why Harris-Walz would be an absolute disaster and Trump-Vance is absolutely necessary for the country in a dire time. And you can prosecute that case, I think, very easily, simply, compellingly, in a way that resonates across party lines. But then the question is going to become, as I always go back to on my black pill take on the elections, you know, can you beat the ballot casting, collecting, counting machine that the Democrats and the regime have imposed against you, plus the information regime that is being imposed upon you? And we'll see probably before Election Day and then on Election Day which side ultimately prevails in that contest.
Yeah, I think the interview was really bad for Kamala. It made it obvious why they don't want her to be interviewed. And it revealed what I have a longer term thesis that I think, you know, the reason to be optimistic, one of many, is that over time, Democrats are going to continue to pay the cost of a last minute switcheroo of their candidate. They weren't ready for Kamala to be the candidate. She doesn't have a policy platform, and having actually worked on a presidential campaign, there's a lot that goes into that in terms of you want to get, you know, the candidate has to agree to what the platform is. Then there has to be approvals. You want to talk to stakeholders so you don't get a rebellion from some portion of your voting bloc. So it's normally you have a lot of time to do that, and they've had none. They didn't have any time to vet Tim Walz or vet their VP candidates, so they ended up stuck with this guy who's got a massive stolen valor problem and can't talk about his military experience, even though that's like what was supposed to be one of his primary pluses. So they just got all these little problems, and then you see that when they have to do an interview, like the other thing is she's not good on her feet. She's not a good extemporaneous speaker. She likes to be on a script, and she's not artful or elegant enough with her words to be able to BS effectively. She's not Bill Clinton. She's not Barack Obama. She's just a much, much weaker politician and a much, much weaker public speaker. And as a result, you get these sort of weak, cruddy interviews. She looked small. She looked like exhausted. I don't know how much sleep she's getting. And she just looked like a mess. So, you know, if that interview went so poorly that they're not going to do another one of those, they're going to hope that they get something out of the debate. But I don't know. I'm a betting man, I would bet on Trump, because I just don't see a way that things get better for the Harris campaign from here on out. And I think that interview is an example of why they can't. They're sort of constrained in their options.
I have another theory as to why the Kamala Harris campaign realizes things are going poorly that I'll bring up in final thoughts. But first, we'll go to Inez to walk us through the Arlington Cemetery Gold Star family controversy that was spun up by the media this weekend involving Trump.
Yeah, speaking of things that the media does care about, after we've gone over all the important things that they don't, they have been focused for the last 8 or 9 days on this alleged controversy of Donald Trump actually attending a ceremony in Section 60 of Arlington. There were photos taken there, which Kamala Harris was official campaign accounts tweeting about how inappropriate that is and how no one should be commander-in-chief if they demonstrate this level of disrespect to the armed services and to our fallen men and women, ignoring, of course, the fact that Donald Trump was invited to be there by those Gold Star families, that they posed in that picture and asked for that picture with him. And that there's very little controversy to this at all. I actually think, in contrast to the last segment where I said I guess Will and I maybe slightly disagree, I think that interview was an overall positive thing. If you take into account all the baselines of the Harris campaign, although I agree with what Will said that there's a ceiling. Like, I don't think she's going any higher than this, right? But this, I think, was a miscalculation based on the assumption that, of course, was correct, that the media was going to come out swinging for them. But I think they did not anticipate that the Gold Star families themselves would film a series of videos basically excoriating both Biden and Harris for their decisions around the Abbey Gate tragedy and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and specifically saying, you were invited to this. We have one of the Gold Star moms saying, you were invited to this. Well, actually, I think mother-in-law. You chose not to attend. You have been nothing but disrespectful to the families of these 13 Americans. The pointing to things like Joe Biden checking his watch during the time when those bodies were brought back home to America. Joe Biden saying things like, no American soldiers have died anywhere in the world under his watch, completely erasing those 13 families' sacrifice. And just, I don't think they anticipated the level of pushback, which has then made it into Trump campaign materials and ads and so on. So I don't know, there's a whole series of questions that could be asked. Obviously, there's a media angle to this, like the focus on this and the attempt to try to smear Trump. Just like disgusting cartoons. Like I saw the New Yorker had a cartoon where it's just Trump pulling down all the American flags off of Arlington graves and replacing them with campaign signs. Like the idea that this is that Trump accepting this invitation is somehow politically illegitimate and gross, when at the same time, I mean, Joe Biden was in the same section of Arlington just a few years ago, and as vice president, using photos from that same section as when he was vice president, right, for campaign materials. So this is not a foreign thing, even though there are, you know, sort of, these seem to be rules that are only enforced in a moment where you're just trying to get the person you don't like politically. But I think this was a mistake. Personally, I'm curious what you guys all think. Like, one, it brings back the disastrous Biden-Harris record on this issue. It brings back the complete disaster and shame, and that it was the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Again, whatever your views are on whether we should withdraw or not, the way in which it was conducted that left these 13 Americans dead, right, was just an embarrassment to the country, and probably a big blinking sign to the rest of the world that America's incompetencies from within are affecting its ability to project power militarily around the world. So I don't think this was a good move on their part to bring this up. I don't think going toe-to-toe publicly with Gold Star families was a good move. This also dovetails with an interviews that Megyn Kelly did with 4 of Tim Walz's actual comrades in arms about what his record was like and what he was like, that do not look good for him. I think overall this was a miscalculation. I think they're going to lose this exchange. I don't know exactly how much it'll matter for the election, hard to say, but I think they are going to lose this exchange. But I'm curious what you think in terms of, is the media power on this going to be enough to, like, because they are not dropping it. Every day there's like a new story about how heinous and callous Donald Trump was to show up at the request of these families to this memorial. So I don't, throwing it out there for thoughts.
Yeah, I think the media really stepped in it, and I genuinely don't think that they knew or understood the extent to which these Abbey Gold Star families have become close with Trump over the past 3.5 years, because they've mostly ignored them. They haven't talked to these people in any meaningful capacity, because they haven't been okayed by the Biden administration. None of these family members have had an audience with Biden or Harris outside of the dignified transfer, which, contrary to Kristen Welker on NBC claiming in an interview with Tom Cotton, Kamala Harris was not at the dignified transfer. Biden was checking his watch the whole time. According to these families' testimonies, he was talking mostly about his own son, Beau Biden, as opposed to their loss. And since then have not been able to get a meeting to even talk about the withdrawal and what went wrong that led to the bombing at Abbey Gate. So I don't think the media anticipated that these families were going to come out and defend Trump, even if they knew that they had invited him to this ceremony. And it was a killer move. I mean, when I saw that Trump was quote tweeting Kamala's attack with just video after video of these Gold Star parents just destroying the Biden administration for their policy decisions, it was just undeniable, an undeniable win for Trump. And now you've actually forced the hand of people like Democratic strategists and activists for the Harris-Walz campaign who have now moved away from attacking Trump to actually attacking the Gold Star families, claiming that they've always been political, that they're just in the tank for Trump. And I got to meet them at the State of the Union this past year. They did not talk about politics. They were hyper-focused on just getting their kids' names said from the dais during the State of the Union. That was all that they wanted. They wanted people to remember their sacrifice. So trying to twist this into, oh, well, they're just political actors is absurd. Now we have this media story out about Jimmy McCain, John McCain's youngest son, coming out in favor of Kamala Harris and criticizing Trump, even though John McCain had used Arlington National Cemetery material in a campaign ad previously. And Jimmy McCain, I'm told reliably, has voted Democrat in the past 3 election cycles, but the media is saying that there's a direct connection between his issues with Trump's photo op at Arlington National Cemetery and why he's decided to change his party registration. They're just sinking to unfathomable lows, and the desperation is incredibly obvious because this exchange did not go the way they anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, I saw it as like maybe the biggest and most obvious comms error, like in the campaign, in the course of the campaign. The thing about this is, given Tim Walz's history with stolen valor, and given the fact that Harris and Biden were ultimately responsible for Abbey-gate and the deaths of so many American service members, they should not be talking about this, and they should want everybody else to stop talking about it. And the way you do that is to not talk about it yourselves. Like the Tim Walz thing was starting to move into the rear view of the news cycle. But no, instead, the Kamala campaign thought it was wise to try and pick a fight with Trump over going to see the veterans' family members. And rightly, I mean, they're getting absolutely smashed for it. Yet another example of how, last minute switcheroo means a slapdash campaign that doesn't have a clear idea of what it's doing, and that makes very easy and obvious mistakes that perhaps a more structured and essentially continuous campaign may not have made. Like, I don't think the Biden campaign alone would have done this. And what I heard is rumors. It was that Kamala's close advisors, the people she brought onto the campaign, were responsible for this particular snafu. So yeah, I think, they're going to keep paying the cost with these incredibly stupid things. And it's such obvious and basic comms. Like in the modern social media world, news cycles are so short. If you just stop talking about something, people usually forget about it in 48 hours. Like, they're the ones who've decided to just keep talking about the fact about these Gold Star families, which is just a continuous reminder that they let all these young soldiers die.
Yeah, that is the seminal point at the end of the day, which is these families were made Gold Star families as a consequence of Biden-Harris policy. That is the story. The story is not that Donald Trump was invited by those families to attend Arlington Cemetery because they wanted him there. And let's note, by the way, also, there's another part of the scandal, which is that it appears that the Biden administration put up roadblocks to allowing Donald Trump to go there in the first place. And it was only the intervention of the Speaker of the House that actually enabled the visit to occur. Those videos from the Gold Star families are absolutely some of the most compelling footage you will see. I think that is precisely why Harris-Walz has doubled down on this. But it's a disaster for them. This is the opposite of hanging a lantern on your problem. This is just illustrating the fact that it was their policies, the Biden-Harris policies, that dishonored the lives and ultimately treated with reckless abandon the lives of our troops. And they're projecting in their attacks on Donald Trump when it was Donald Trump who kept America out of entanglements. When Donald Trump the administration did engage, it did so with overwhelming force, but in very narrow situations, so as not to get our forces bogged down. And that is how ultimately you honor the lives of our troops. You defend their lives, and you only apply force in situations where it's going to redound to the benefit of our national interests. You don't treat them with reckless abandon. You certainly don't use them to engage in all sorts of dystopic kind of societal experiments abroad that ultimately demoralize your fighting force and undermine your national interests. So this is a huge unforced error, and I continue to believe that national security and foreign policy, Trump Vance can absolutely destroy Harris-Walz on this count, but that's obviously maybe not the most important issue in the minds of Americans, but I think maybe it ought to be. It's a dangerous world out there. Who do you trust to keep us safe from a variety of adversaries? And I think the answer is very clear.
I am going to go ahead and take the prerogative to go first and final thoughts. We were talking a bit earlier about how much the Kamala campaign realizes that they're in trouble, that they have to shield her from this very quick election cycle. And there's a news story out today indicating that the Biden administration is prepared to go after Russia for allegedly influencing the 2024 election. And to me, this is a very clear indicator that some of these polls that have come out post-convention, namely the Morning Consult poll today that had Kamala up like 8 points in Wisconsin and Michigan, are not being reflected in the Kamala Harris campaign internals and in any of the polls that are actually being done properly. I don't think the Biden administration would be going so hard on Russia if they legitimately thought that Kamala Harris was running away in these swing states, because she's most likely not. And the substance of their complaints about Russia hinge on the Russian state TV network RT, or Russia Today, which is in such dire straits. They are auctioning off their DC studio. To say that they're irrelevant would be an understatement. But this is the plan to sow discontent and questions about the election if Trump were to win. For as much as we hear from the left that Trump is not going to accept the results of the election, it's really consistently the Democrats that don't accept the results of elections. They just do it in sort of sneaky, underhanded ways, like claiming that there is a foreign influence campaign, when in 2016 it was like posts that got 7,000 impressions on Facebook.
Following up on that, I think just on the social media point, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Brazil's banning of X. As I've argued before, I think that this should be seen not necessarily as an international speech policing effort, but as part and parcel of a, frankly, U.S. regime-driven effort to control and manipulate narratives by ultimately bringing the social media companies to heel. And so this is one assault among a slew of assaults, also from the EU via the Digital Services Act, which I think we talked about last episode. All of this is part and parcel of an effort on the eve of voting beginning in America to ramp up the pressure, specifically on X, as the one massive social media platform that poses a threat to the regime by simply allowing people to put forth information and opinions that the regime doesn't like, that are derogatory to it. I suspect that the censorship regime is going to dramatically accelerate its efforts in the coming days and weeks. Again, the fact that you haven't seen a robust effort by, of course, the Biden-Harris administration to actually challenge Brazil for its efforts, to chide its leadership, to threaten with any number of levers that it has to punish its leaders for their attack on an American company that fosters our speech, is a damning indictment of a regime, but also illustrates precisely its very nature. It concurs with what Brazil has done. The silence is consent here with this anti-First Amendment effort, anti-free speech effort that we see international regimes engaging in, and that, of course, our regime engages in less directly, so as to avoid skirting the First Amendment, which the Supreme Court, of course, punted on.
Yeah, I was going to mention the Brazil thing, but just to add to what Ben said before going on a totally different track here, would a potential Harris administration protect American free speech rights abroad if, for example, European country decided to try to prosecute and then arrest an American for spreading misinformation on a platform like X. I think to ask the question is to answer it. So there are some elements to this that, despite the very clear legal differences between us and the continent, and certainly a country like Brazil in terms of the First Amendment, there are domestic consequences to these things. The thing that I wanted to bring up, just to go in a little bit of a different direction, there's a New Yorker piece in the last couple days called "Why Are So Many People Going No Contact with Their Parents?" Of course, describing a political divide in a family and a daughter who refuses to talk to her entire family because, and what it seems like, of course, the New Yorker piece is kind of vague about a lot of these things, but it seems like she's angry at them for not getting the COVID-19 vaccine for her wedding and over sort of sexual politics or whatever, like feminism versus red pill, whatever, like, and that's the reason she has gone no contact with her family. And so it goes through a few of these examples. The piece itself is a little ambivalent about whether or not this is a good thing, but it's clear that this is a trend. I think it's something that is just unfathomably sad. That there is this idea that you need freedom, complete freedom from every human relationship, especially those that are unchosen, right? Like blood ties and family. But at the same time, even the left, if you remember, even Hillary Clinton wrote something or had something ghostwritten for her about this, that loneliness and atomization are some of the biggest killers in terms of lifespan, health, everything else. And then, of course, just a generalized malaise and misery. And part of that is breaking down the family. Friendship is on a sharp decline from previous generations. And of course, even just having relationships at all, whether in the friendship context, whether in the romantic context, or whether in the blood context, all of these relationships are under strain for a variety of reasons. We can talk at length about in modernity, but it's pretty clear that this is one that's just adding to the pile, is choosing whether or not for incredibly minor reasons. Of course, there are people who can't talk to their families for like very legitimate and horrific and sad sort of family circumstances, but for politics or for other sort of minor disagreements within families or resentments within families, to not speak to your blood relatives is clearly on the upswing. It's clearly a trend. It's yet another trend that's going to make us more atomized, more miserable.
Yeah, my final thoughts on this Daryl Cooper, Tucker Carlson kerfuffle. I mean, Daryl Cooper went on to Carlson. I haven't actually watched the podcast, but I'm seeing a bunch of people, a lot of criticism over some of Cooper's remarks that seem very, very hostile to Churchill and perhaps a little bit too sympathetic to Hitler, which is a remarkable thing to say. I don't know Daryl, but I've had like reasonable interactions with him on Twitter. In my personal experience with him, I don't see him as like a deeply unreasonable person, but I get the sense that he's a seriously contrarian person. And I just wanted to relay an anecdote to people, especially in our space, that, you know, contrarianism is cool and revisionist history is interesting, but you should always start by reading the standard history of almost any topic you're interested in. And the reason you want to read its standard history first is that the contrarian history isn't, sometimes the standard history will be wrong, but more often than not, it's right. And the contrarian history will be often referencing things and critiquing things in the standard history. And if you haven't read the original claims and the original evidence for those, you'll often make mistakes. I think that, and that's what he's getting hit for here. I think his portrayal of Churchill as this monster is deeply contrarian. And I think it's just wrong if you understand what Churchill actually was doing and went through. And, you know, I mean, people are bringing up Dresden again. I think like there's a whole book to be written about Allied bombing strategy in World War II, but you know, this isn't the era of precision bombing, for example. There's area bombing it was area bombing or nothing for a lot of these cases. And I think people often forget that. So I guess the overarching message for the final thought is be careful with contrarian history and revisionist history. You're often going to get things wrong.
All right, that's going to do it for us this week on NatCon Squad. On behalf of Will, Inez, and Ben, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you all next week.